Day one, baby.
Day one.
To this day.
To this day. To this day.
To this day.
We're covering today's top boxing news. Okay, we'll start with this. Well, Anthony Joshua had this to say. He says, as a British fighter, I don't get respect from the world media. He's quoted as saying, last year was a difficult time in my career. Joshua said to JD Sports, last year was a real tough year. As a British heavyweight fighter, we never get the respect from the world media, which is governed by America to a certain degree. Because we're British, Americans are going to take care of Americans. So when I lost, you take challenges. The goal is to win 100%. I felt, and still feel that today, that everyone had written me off, so I said, cool. They're telling me, man, Josh shouldn't go in there for the rematch. He's crazy, Joshua told JD Sports. I'm talking about some of my idols and stuff like that. So the best thing about Saudi Arabia was proving to myself that no matter what the idols tell me, or the experts, no one can go against the gut feeling that I have. That's why at the end of the fight, there's a clip where Eddie's jumping, my manager's jumping, and I'm kind of standing there. I remember when I said that, when I win, everybody must bow to me. So it was like my emperor moment. I said what I was going to do. So talk the talk, walk the walk. That was the best thing about Saudi. Joshua was scheduled to face mandatory challenger Kubrat Pulev on June 20th, but the contest was postponed due to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic.
We know.
Even though there is a massive negative effect of what's going on, the positive you have to take from it is the quality time you're spending with your family. So aside from the day-to-day hustle and bustle and training, I have prioritized the attention that I'm spending with my family. So that's been a priority of mine. There's a lot of truth to what Anthony Joshua is saying in regards to the media, particularly the American media, and how they cover boxing. That as a British heavyweight, he doesn't get the same respect that someone else would. I mean, think about Kevin Ioli's recent article about how Deontay Wilder, of all people, revived the heavyweight division.
What?
As opposed to Tyson Fury, who liberated 3 of the 4 major titles from Vladimir Klitschko, who was the reigning unified champion for something like 9+ years.
Never mind him.
I actually covered that subject extensively. For those interested in that video, I'll leave the link to it in the description box. But back to the American media and how it covers boxing. Joshua's not lying when he says that British heavyweight doesn't get the same respect that an American heavyweight would, because you got Kevin Ioli,
that guy,
other pundits like him, giving boxing fans a very skewed perspective as far as what's going on in these weight classes. They'd sooner have you believe that a guy like Wilder's the reason the heavyweight division is thriving, when Wilder was a part of the previous era of heavyweights. He just didn't do anything of note. Previous era of heavyweights that was ruled by Vladimir and Vitaly Klitschko.
Oh.
This is an era of boxing that many Americans weren't interested in.
Paid no mind.
It's because they didn't have a pony in the show. Essentially, what Joshua is describing isn't just a bias against British fighters, it's a bias against any fighter that isn't an American fighter. As the perfect example of this is Vladimir Klitschko. Very few heavyweights in the history of heavyweight boxing had a reign like Vladimir Klitschko's reign. Yet Bert Sugar, a very well-known historian in the sport of boxing, was neither a fan of Vlad or his brother.
And what we're watching is total lack of interest in the heavyweight division. And the problem is the Klitschkos. They might be dominating, but they're bored. They just want to control the fight. Action is secondary. They don't put themselves into trouble. They don't take chances. To them, it's a chess game. And you get fights like David Haye and Klitschko. All I know is my foot fell asleep in the 7th round and I followed suit in the 8th.
Neither one of those two guys were Bert Sugar's cup of tea, and it's the funniest thing because any heavyweight today should be so lucky as to have a reign the likes of Vitaly Klitschko, where you retire a champion, or Vladimir Klitschko, where you become the authority in the division for a span of something like 9+ years. The remnants of the Klitschko era still linger here today, and they don't just linger as journeymen.
On a journey.
They had to decorate somebody's resume. Both Alexander Povetkin and Kubrat Pulev here today are still ranked as top 10 fighters, top 10 contenders. What were solid fighters then are still solid fighters now.
Still relevant.
Those are the kind of guys that Vladimir beat, but those are the kind of guys that he gets no credit for beating. I remember when Bryant Jennings locked horns with Luis Ortiz, everybody was falling out of their chair because Ortiz had beat that guy.
Fair enough.
That was a guy that was beat
When he was undefeated, no less.
by Vladimir Klitschko. Different fashion, yes, but better still. Doesn't Vladimir deserve the same as, if not more credit than Luis Ortiz did for beating Bryant Jennings?
I'd say so.
Well, you might, but many Americans weren't interested in Vladimir Klitschko's conquest of the heavyweight division. No, there are very few reigns, heavyweight champion, that mirror the reign of Vladimir Klitschko, a guy who fought anyone from Alexander Povetkin to Kubrat Pulev to Samuel Peter to Ruslan Chaigev to Eddie Chambers to Tony Thompson to Lamont Brewster to Calvin Brock to Chris Bird to Francois Botha to Ray Mercer to Hasim Rahman, anyone from David Hay to Axel Schultz, a guy who gave 12 undefeated fighters their first professional losses, a guy who ruled from April 2006 to November of 2015. Guy who took on all comers, anyone from your reigning champions to your top contenders to your mean in between guys like Alex Lepai and Jean-Marc Mormac. There were very few fighters of the Klitschko era that Klitschko himself didn't take on, short of his brother.
Vitaly.
If there really were anything missing from Vladimir Klitschko's resume, I'd have to say that would be it, but who's actually expecting, or who was actually expecting for Vladimir to take on his own brother?
Nobody.
Better still, Vladimir was a reigning champion who pretty much took on all comers for about, 9, close to 10 years?
Yeah.
And the American media was largely uninterested in this.
No respect.
This does accent what Anthony Joshua is talking about. It is a matter of fact that here today, Anthony Joshua has taken on more world champions than either Tyson Fury or Deontay Wilder. He certainly unseated more top contenders, divisional top 10 fighters, than either of them.
It's the truth.
After that one loss to Andy Ruiz, it was the American media that wrote him off.
Almost immediately.
Of little faith.
As the American media and the American boxing fan is guilty of very many gross oversights, being slaves to the moment, partial treatment towards whatever fighter, whatever fighters they identify with when attempting to cover the sport. It does seem to get lost in the sauce that you're supposed to be covering the sport, right?
Right.
And you do realize that the sport don't just consist of fighters that you identify with. Yet, how many times this is how many Americans choose to cover the sport? Not all, no, but some. The ones who would deprive Anthony Joshua of the credit he's talking about, the credit that he feels he deserves. When he lost that fight to Andy Ruiz, he lost that fight in devastating fashion.
Dropped 4 times.
Goes out there with that same guy for a second time in an immediate rematch that many people didn't think he stood much chance of winning. Many people doubted his resolve, his intestinal fortitude ahead of that rematch.
Where'd they go?
Goes out there, he puts on a clinic. The same guy who dropped him 4 times can't do nothing with him in the second fight. That was due to Anthony Joshua's boxing acumen, that he's not just a great physical specimen, but this guy can be a cerebral fighter that makes adjustments, that can adapt to a situation. The ever-present jab and movement of Anthony Joshua, shutting the smaller man out, depriving him of opportunities to do what he did before. There were plenty of people that were saying that Anthony Joshua was going to lose this same fight in same fashion to the first fight. There were plenty of people saying this ahead of the second fight, only so that they could deprive him of the credit he deserved after the second fight. What, they don't like seeing a guy that big be a cerebral fighter?
Is that it?
I vaguely recall a very similar sentiment reference to Lennox Lewis when he was shaking shit up. He was an active fighter, active champion, a guy who fought and he won from Vander Holyfield to Hasim Rahman, and he went from David Tua to Francois Botha to Frank Bruno, from Grant to Galata, from McCall to Mercer, from Mercer to Morrison, to Donovan Razor Ruddock.
Tough fucking guys.
When in my age group, we'll already be familiar with all of those names. All of those guys, they weren't certified killers.
In their time.
Tough outs, tough fighters. Yet, whilst Lennox Lewis was beating these guys, he was largely unappreciated by the American boxing fan and some of the American media.
That's right.
These are just two of the more obvious examples of the kind of uneven criticism, uneven coverage the sport of boxing has gotten over the years. The reign of Vladimir Klitschko, which went mostly unappreciated, and the reign of Lennox Lewis, which also wasn't all that appreciated at that time. I mean, I can tell you firsthand, there were a lot of people who didn't like Lennox Lewis. For some people, that guy couldn't do nothing right in his heyday.
They ain't like him.
Not for them. So, what Anthony Joshua is describing is not some linear perspective that is exclusive to him from where he is sitting. He is touching on something very real. However, I will say that he needn't waste any time, any attention on the uneven criticisms and coverage that boxing gets from the American media, as there are some American fighters who experienced the exact same thing that he is describing. I mean, take Floyd Mayweather and Brian Kenny. Floyd Mayweather couldn't do nothing right as far as Brian Kenny was concerned.
Absolutely nothing.
As it stands, Floyd Mayweather is one of the most accomplished, if not the most accomplished, American fighter of the postmodern era.
Don't tell Brian Kenny that.
As he will find fault with anything and everything Floyd Mayweather does, from how he ties his shoes to how he fries an egg. You see, even though the American media is guilty of uneven criticism, uneven coverage, biased practices when it comes to certain fighters, for or against those fighters, even though the American media is guilty of all these different things, there are some American fighters who have been on the receiving end of these practices. But these practices, they don't tell the whole story. I mean, they really don't. For all the Americans who really weren't concerned with the reign of Vladimir Klitschko, weren't interested, weren't excited about what he was doing in the division, that really didn't stop Vladimir Klitschko and Tyson Fury from packing the Esprit Arena in Dusseldorf with 55,000 fans. It certainly hasn't stopped Anthony Joshua from putting up the kind of numbers that he's been putting up. The same Vladimir Klitschko, who Americans weren't all that concerned with, is the same Vladimir Klitschko that helped Anthony Joshua put up some of the biggest numbers the United Kingdom has ever seen in terms of pay-per-views sold and those in attendance. That same Vladimir Klitschko that the Americans weren't concerned with, that's the guy that helped Anthony Joshua put on one of the biggest fights the United Kingdom has ever seen. In spite of the Americans not being all concerned with that guy and what was his reign as a champion. That fight was a major success, and the role of an American audience wasn't the least bit pivotal to its success. So it did good numbers here in spite of the airtime. I mean, you do realize that, right? That fight aired during the afternoon and evening hours, as opposed to primetime hours for a boxing match, which would be much later in the day. Yet in spite of this, that fight did close to 700,000 viewers on a premium cable network. Comparatively, if you look at what cards have been staged on premium cable networks here today, Joshua versus Klitschko did substantially better numbers than the average PBC card you'd find on a premium cable network here today. Simply a matter of fact by the numbers. Better still, the American audience's involvement, when it comes to that fight, wasn't pivotal to its success at all. It was just a nice bonus. The fight itself and the money that it generated, that was shouldered by the paying public, the paying customers in another market entirely.
Yeah.
The UK market.
Yeah.
They, in effect, made that fight the massive success that it was, the massive global success. You see, while Anthony Joshua is right that the coverage that boxing gets here in the States is often skewed, it's often biased, it's often unfair, that coverage really is only as relevant as the audience it is intended for, and that audience is the American boxing fan. And when it comes to the American boxing fan really isn't what the American boxing fan used to be, as Americans as a whole aren't spending the kind of money they used to spend on boxing. Thus, their relevance to boxing as a sport overall is kind of being overstated by Anthony Joshua. The relevance of the American boxing pundit in relation to the American boxing fan. I think it's inaccurate to say that the American pundit dictates how the world views boxing. I think he's giving those pundits and that audience overall a little bit too much credit. Because when you think about that audience and what effect it's having on the sport, I mean, how many of these guys has the American boxing fan turned into household names here in America? Are Americans packing out halls, packing out arenas to see the likes of a Jarrell Miller, or a Charles Martin, or a Dominic Breazeale, or a Bryant Jennings? Comes to the American audience. Let's not even limit it to the heavyweight division. Let's talk about all these different American fighters throughout all these different weight classes and how many of them aren't household names, even though they are Americans. And one would assume that if anybody's got the inside track on the American market and how to get the most out of it, it would be the American fighters. Yet as it stands, most weight classes, most of these American fighters really aren't household names. That in and of itself begs the question, what is the relevance of the American boxing fan? And in essence, what is the relevance of the American pundit?
Who caters to the American boxing fan?
You know, this ain't your father's era of boxing. This ain't your father's era of boxing, to where most of the elite level talent is coming from the same region of the world, the same place here in the US of A. Boxing is now more a world sport than it has ever been, and I say that all the time. Thus, the kind of coverage that it gets is a little bit more universal, and it's not just limited to what the Americans are saying or what the Americans are watching. The Americans probably didn't care too much about Ryota Murata's fights, but that didn't stop a whole lot of Japanese people from tuning into him, and the same is true of Naoya Inoue and his fight with Nonito Donaire. I defy you to show me an American that's putting up the kind of TV ratings that that fight put up here in the States. That way, I think that Anthony Joshua was right about the skewed perspectives that some American pundits and American boxing fans might have, but I think he's wrong about the level of influence they have on how the sport is viewed, especially on a global stage. I think that perhaps Anthony Joshua feels a bit jilted by the American media, but upon further analysis, I think what he would find is that there are some American fighters who feel jilted by the American media. Thus, it's much ado about nothing. It's a small matter. Perhaps the coverage that boxing gets here with certain of its pundits is unfair, short-sighted, full of gross oversights. Perhaps it is, but its influence overall to the way the world views boxing is minimal. I think that so long as Anthony Joshua stays the course, continues to do what he has been doing, time itself will be fair to him and his legacy in all the ways that the pundits here in the States may not have been. Thus, it is nothing to lose sleep over, nothing to spend too much time on.